I will say that I'm actually going to be here next week, so you can't say goodbye to me just yet. Sorry. Hi. It's a little bit intimidating being up here in front of you all, who I have learned so much from, and I feel like I'll just be regurgitating back to you what you have embodied and shown me as a beloved family. But I figured, what a better way of preparing for seminary than sharing with my beloved family. So I expect you all to give honest feedback, and I will accept notes if you want to give them to me. But I do have a warning in that I know it's been a really stormy week for beloved, and but our story gets a little stormy as well, so I would be amiss if I didn't follow. So as you heard, our passage today is about Jesus, the disciples, and a storm. And like all stories in the Bible, it's a part of a network of other stories compiled into little books, and each has its own unique perspective and message. And in general, the Gospel of Mark is short and snappy, lots of action stories with Jesus doing things, and a few parables and teachings. Last week we heard about a few of the parables, and Jesus went into even more detail for the disciples, who, despite Jesus' efforts to explain clearly, still seemed to be having a hard time understanding. In various places in Mark, the disciples are described as confused, their hearts are hardened, or they explicitly do what Jesus says not to do. So before this storm scene, Jesus had just finished sharing some parables about mustard seeds and about the kingdom of God that we heard about last week. So I'm going to read the passage again, and I invite you to close your eyes if you'd like, or read along. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. And he said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe, and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" So Jesus suggests a trip across to the other side of the lake. At this point, he had been talking for a while, and seeing as he promptly took a nap as soon as they got settled in the boat, I think he was probably a little tired. And I wonder if it was hard for him to get away from the social and intimate setting of being trapped on a boat with your disciples. The introverts in the room might understand what I'm talking about. It can be difficult to explain to the social folks, like, "Hey, I need to get away." Maybe the disciples in the boat were upset that Jesus left them. I mean, it was Jesus who suggested getting on the boat in the first place. I wonder if that feeling of abandonment shows a kind of expectation that Jesus would be with them all the time, giving directions, guiding them. But as we all know how the story goes, Jesus wouldn't be always with them. This was training, not a blind following. So after Jesus finally made it away, it says suddenly a windstorm popped up. At this point in the story, we have to remember that this sea, a symbol of chaos and disaster in ancient mythology, was also the home to at least 5 of the disciples who were now on this boat with Jesus. They grew up on those waters and had spent their lives navigating the tumultuous seas. But apparently the boat was overwhelmed. Even though these guys had spent their entire life navigating the storms, the boat was overwhelmed. The story gives us no clue that they were working that hard to make it through it either. They go directly to Jesus. You see, I think they were sulking. I think they were bummed that Jesus left them, did not understand why they were going to the other side, and Jesus was asleep, so he couldn't give them directions in the face of the immense storm, and they desperately wanted directions. And by the time they realized their own buildup of frustration, the boat was already sinking. So did they really not know what to do? Or was it easier to turn to their teacher, their guide, and wonder why Jesus was not doing more. In a tone of righteous indignation, I hear them saying, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" It's a funny question. Obviously, Jesus cares for the disciples, and I don't think it's on Jesus' agenda to die while sailing across the sea just yet. Too soon. That's later. "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Sounds more like a verdict than a question. The disciples look to Jesus for answers and guidance and direction, and since Jesus isn't showing up and giving answers and guidance and direction in this extreme storm, they are a little lost. It seems like Jesus has abandoned them. But Jesus responds immediately, in some kind of order of operations. See, calm must be established first. If people are in that kind of like heightened anxiety, they probably won't be able to hear anything that Jesus has to say. So Jesus gets up and says, "Peace, be still." I can imagine that the calm, collected nature of Jesus' quick, determined voice establishing authority in the midst of the storm did more than just calm nature. I think it calmed the fearful hearts of the disciples, whose reaction to the natural storm was a storm of fear and blame within themselves. "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" I think the words "peace, be still" were not just to the waves and to the winds. But Jesus' response to the storm, and then in turn to the disciples, do help us understand the nature of these different storms. Now that the calm was established, Jesus turns to the disciples and asks, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" The storm in the disciples was one of fear and lack of faith. The fear is obvious. They were afraid of the storm, which is entirely natural. But still, these were fishermen we're talking about. It's not like they had never worked through a storm before. So Jesus' question of why you were afraid makes sense, but I still wonder, why were they afraid? But then the question, why does Jesus ask, "Have you still no faith?" Faith is a kind of complicated word. It's not so much like a belief system of like facts, but it's an act based on trust in what you believe. It's a verb. Faith is action rooted in trust and belief. It's a doing thing. So how were the disciples lacking in faith? They obviously acted on their trust of Jesus' ability and power to calm the storm because they turned to Jesus. So it's not a lack of faith in Jesus necessarily. And Jesus showed that, yes, he did have this extraordinary power to calm the seas. So there's no question that the disciples faithed in Jesus' ability and power. So why did Jesus ask, "Have you still no faith?" There's one more piece in the Gospel of Mark that I think might help us understand. And it happens to be in the last chapter. Throughout Mark, the disciples are kind of bumbling fools. Like I said earlier, Mark and Angie both mentioned this in their sermons the previous weeks. But they kind of just don't comprehend what Jesus is doing and saying. They come to wrong conclusions, and they don't really follow what Jesus intended. And so it is at the end of Mark, after Jesus said over and over that he was going to die and leave them to continue the work of God, that the ladies Mary Magdalene, James' mother Mary, and Salome go to visit the tomb of Jesus. And they find that the stone has been rolled away. They find that, just as Jesus said, he would be gone. And their response is silence. It says, they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. These are actually the final words of the earliest manuscripts that we find of Mark. Later versions kind of have some other endings, but the earliest version, those are the final words. They were afraid. And those are the words that leave the reader or the listener to decide, how will the end be? Would fear be the final word, silencing the message of Jesus' life and the power of God at work in Jesus and in those following him? This is our link. When fear has the final word, the creative power of God is not illuminated in the action of the people of God. Be it Jesus or the disciples, Jesus had the courage to act in the face of fear, but the disciples had that knowledge within them. They were fishermen, and at least five of them were fishermen. I have no doubt that they had witnessed and weathered through many storms before, but perhaps they wanted their leader to save them. Isn't that the job of a teacher, to guide and direct? Perhaps the storm was more fierce than any they had ever been in, and they doubted their own ability. I don't know the origin of their fear, but what I can tell from the story is they did nothing. Just like the women at the end of Mark, they silenced their own ability to do something because of their fear. And then instead of facing their fear and acting in light of it, they looked at Jesus and said, "What are you doing to help the situation?" In doing that, they denied their own part in the work of God's kingdom coming to earth. They denied their own part in establishing calm in the face of disastrous storms. They allowed fear and blame the final word. Their response at the end of amazement and wonder at Jesus' ability to face fear is still, I think, a somewhat limited response. In the rest of Mark, Jesus would continually push the disciples to actually act in the face of fear. And it takes Jesus up and leaving them to get them to finally do it. We are in the season of Pentecost, celebrating the power of God's Spirit in each of us to face this world full of fear. That message of action rings loud and clear in light of recent events this week. I cannot speak to you all today without mentioning the horrifying tragedy of the shooting in Charleston, South Carolina, at the hands of a 21-year-old white man raised under the ideology of white supremacy. Are not his words the embodiment of fear and accusation? You all are raping our women and taking over our country. His words fall like a storm, meant to intimidate and silence. But because we are people living in the same world as Dylan Roof, we are left with a question and an open-ended story. As people who believe in the power of God's creative love that must be enacted in this world, we have a clear question that this story makes us face. Will we respond according to what we can do? Will we name racism for what it is and act against it in our city? And also, do we feel like we have the right, like Jesus showed the disciples, to demand calm, to look at the storm of racism and say, "Peace, be still," to acknowledge that there is no room for hate and ignorant ideology to persist? It's somewhat easier to look at Charleston, South Carolina, and apply some kind of verdict, to put it on your Facebook page or make a tweet and be sad and then go on. But how will we respond? I'm aware that, like the ending of Mark, there is no comfort in my message today. And there is, for me, no comfort in hearing the family representatives of Reverend Clements Pinckney, Cynthia Hurd, Reverend Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Tywanza Sanders, Ethel Lance, Susie Jackson, DePayne Middleton Doctor, the Reverend Daniel Simmons, and Mira Thompson offer forgiveness. There is no comfort when a white man's fear of his black brothers and sisters had the final word on 9 people's lives on this earth. There is no comfort when fear of an unarmed black man or teenage black girls has the final word in our police force and judicial system. I have no answers tonight, and I have no promises. But I do have a poem written by a Birminghamian who works with Magic City Agriculture Project as they try to do the slow work of dismantling racism in this city through trainings, worker co-ops, and developing local communities. It's entitled 3:25 a.m., June 20th, 2015, by Majadi Barudi. Blood and gore, death and rancor I am feeling. Every drop, every scream and holler, every bit of pain. Can't sleep, sleep can't come. Coming to sleep, sleep runs. Running away like small children, hiding. Pain, hiding. Hiding pain. As far away as Dynamite Hill here in 9th District, here across from Angela Davis's childhood home. Here in pain, here in grief. I hear the shattering of flesh. Black flesh 9. Black flesh 9. Black blood 9. I hear the blood shattering, trying to sleep, can't sleep, sleep can't come, but it haunts. They, the 9, are yelling my name. They are calling me. They are talking to me, speaking words of fire and blood, the fire and blood in their veins. I'm not a child of incessant prayer. I'm not a child of hope. I am hope's anger. I am hope pissed off. I'm not violent. I am hope's vengeance. I am bone cracker. I am cemetery dirt and unexplained shadows. I see shadows. I can't sleep. I hear the screams of liberation. I am Bessie's child. I am not a child of hope. I am Kali's child. I am not a child of incessant prayer. Bessie and Kali had a baby boy. He hears shadows and sees the whispering of sound in the night. I can't sleep. Sleep can't hug me. Sleep hates me. Sleep is chanting. Sleep is chanting. Black flesh 9. Black flesh 9. Black blood 9. I am Bessie's child. I am not a child of hope. I am Kali's child. Like I said, it's heavy. The storm of realizing how entrenched racism is in our country, in our city, is heavy. And my tendency is to want to turn to our government or our faith leaders and ask, do you not care that we are perishing? But I wonder what Jesus' response will be to me, to us, in light of this storm. Will he look at us after the storm has subsided and ask, why were you afraid? Have you still no faith?